Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for Tuesdays with the Diocese. I'm so happy that you're here. I am going to ask a favor of you, just a couple things. So as you're connected, I ask that you stay muted unless there's a point when you're invited to talk or you want to ask a question or talk. There will be times when Trish wants us to give input. So I'm going to ask you to do that. There's a button on the bottom along the bottom. It says react. And so you can push that react or select react, and then you can raise your hand. And then Trish will know that you want to ask something or comment on something. The other thing I'm going to ask is if you're not showing your video, we really want you to show your video because you are the face of Christ and we're all the face of Christ. And so I want you to show your video. So I know several of you are connected, but now is the time to show your video. So when we come back together, it's not a black screen, but we see you. And we love seeing the face of Christ in you. So anyway, I invite you to turn that on. So Trish Keller is going to present tonight on Cardinal John Henry Newman. And we're so excited that Trish said yes to this. Trish, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And I'm going to turn it over to you at this point.
Okay, you're welcome, Colleen. And thank you, everybody who's on Zoom tonight. I so appreciate it. Before I jump into what we're going to be doing here tonight, I'd like to offer up a beautiful daily prayer that was written by St. John Henry Newman himself. And he was such a beautiful writer. And this will be our opening prayer. May God support us all the day long till the shades lengthen and the evening comes and the busy world is hushed and the fever of life is over and our work is done. Then in his mercy, may he give us a safe lodging and a holy rest and peace at last. Amen. So opening with those words, I'd like to just again say thank you everybody for coming. As Colleen said, I'm Trish Keller. I'm a parishioner at St. Dominic's in Garden City, and I'm part of the staff for Newman University in Western Kansas at our outreach center. And my role is to speak about Newman's Catholic identity and mission and core values to faculty, staff, and students and our community. And I also teach an introductory theology class for Newman online. So February is Heritage Month at Newman, when all month long we celebrate the influence and the spirit of St. John Henry Newman and also St. Maria de Matthias. And if you don't know her, Maria is the founders of the Adorers of the Blood of Christ, who are the religious sisters who sponsor NU. So you can see on our slide some of the great things that are happening in Western Kansas, thanks to Newman University. Of course, our main campus is in Wichita, but our programs here in Western Kansas are specifically designed to serve people who are unable to pick up and move away to a distant campus to complete their bachelor's degree. So Newman is all about serving and serving the underserved. And this area was determined to be an underserved, almost like a higher education desert. So we have key partnerships with our wonderful community colleges in the area in Garden City, Dodge City, and Liberal. And through those partnerships, Newman or students who graduate from those community colleges can transfer their entire associate's degree seamlessly to Newman to attend one of the programs that you see here on the screen. And then with each program, depending on, it varies on the financial aid and scholarship opportunities that are possible, but we definitely try to incentivize students there. And right now we're especially proud of something new that's happening. So we are launching in this coming fall 2026, a diagnostic medical sonography program. And this is really groundbreaking because it took a very unique partnership among, I should say, Newman University and Garden City Community College, and then our local hospital system, Common Spirit. And because all of us were willing and determined to work together, again, we at Newman can live out our core service, our core value of service by meeting a community need. So our hospitals need workers, our hospitals need skilled sonographers, but how can we train more people who are local and have them stay and live and work locally. So this wonderful partnership between Common Spirit and Garden City Community College and Newman is going to make that happen. And then in the fall of 27, so a year from this fall, we're adding radiologic technology through that same partnership. So I just say cheers to our area community colleges, especially Garden City Community College, so that we can serve more students, but then also serve our local workforces. So our namesake is, of course, John Henry Newman, our newest doctor of the church. And if you're wondering about my Zoom background, this is not my house, but this is John Henry Newman's study in Birmingham, England. So it's still intact at the oratory in Birmingham, England. So that's what that looks like. When he was named church doctor, he was named a co-patron of education along with Thomas Aquinas, which I think is so fitting because of the many things that St. Newman was known for. One was his dedication to education and being an educator, but he was also a scholarly thinker. He was also a friend to many. He was also a pastor, and he's probably the world's most famous convert to Catholicism from the Anglican Church, and then later moved into Catholic priesthood. So if you know anything about his life and work, you know that we're going to be able to barely just scratch the surface of his life and thought. But we're going to do our best. But I've set my goal reasonably. So I'm calling this session a Newman 101, or in a more clever way, a sort of Newman for newbies. So if you're new to John Henry Newman, you are welcome here. So here's how we're going to approach and break down our time together. We're going to start with church doctors. What are they? Where did they come from? Why do we have them? And then we'll move into some history of Newman University. And then, of course, we'll delve into Newman's life and work. And then sprinkled throughout the evening, we will be reflecting on short excerpts or snippets of Newman's thought. So his writing is vast, and he was a very prolific writer. So we're just going to take some samples, and those reflection times will also serve as break times. So if you need just to take a restroom break or whatever, you'll be able to do that during that time. So let's go ahead and jump into Doctors of the Church. So the first thing we need to do when we're talking about Doctors of the Church is to forget any association with medicine or the healthcare system, because we're Catholics and we like Latin. Latin is the language of the church. So the word docere means to teach. So you can just visually see that we derive the word doctor from docere as meaning teacher. And if you think about the word doctrine, that's another connection with that. Ecclesiae, of course, means church. So our doctores ecclesiae are teachers of the church. But they aren't just ordinary catechists. So they are men and women of great learning, great holiness. And in fact, the church uses the word eminent to describe these teachers. So during their lifetimes, they all did different things. They all brought different gifts to the table. Some might have written about the dual nature of Christ, others about the Trinity, others about Scripture, others about grace, spirituality, morality. But what they all have in common is that the work that they produced and left behind, not only did it resonate with their peers and their contemporaries, but it did in the same with generations that followed, and then even us today, and will seemingly continue to be a resource for the church in the future. So I want you to guess, how many people do you think we're talking about? How many doctors does the church have? And I've got 3 numbers on the screen, and only one of those numbers is correct. So no one, you don't need to shout out, but I'll just give you a minute to think about that. And the answer is 38. So if you decided, yeah, the church has 38 doctors, you got that right. And Newman, of course, was number 38. So he was just named a doctor of the church by Pope Leo on All Saints' Day back in November. So let's look at some numbers just to get some numerical context. We know our church history spans 2,000 plus years. From those 2,000 plus years of history, more than 10,000 holy men and women have been canonized as saints. And of that 10,000 plus, only 38 have been named or designated as doctors. So that's going to give you a sense of their impact, their uniqueness. They're unique from other saints, but they're also unique from one another. And then I would argue their genius. So Colleen mentioned, or we were talking about before the Zoom started, actually, on the adult formation page on her website, on the diocesan website, there are a couple of handouts that I had her post. And one is entitled More Information. And in that More Information handout, there's lots of different internet links that you can click on for more information. And in particular, I want you to know there's one article on church doctors where you can get a full list of the 38 doctors and what their specialty was, how they were unique and why they were made doctors. So I'll let you kind of do that additional research on their own. But there's one more thing that's on our screen. I don't know if you've noticed, but why do we have a 4 in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide? I'll keep you in suspense for a second.
Yeah.
The number of female doctors. I know somebody had that in their mind. Okay, so of the 38 doctors, 4 of them are women. Local favorite, Catherine of Siena, because our hospital used to be St. Catherine Hospital here in Garden City. Also Teresa of Avila, Therese of Lisieux, and then Hildegard of Bingen. So those are 4 female church doctors. So now we're going to kind of transition to see who came up with this idea of even designating doctors and when did that happen. So to learn about that, we're going to have to travel back in time. And I'm not going to give you all the information straight up, but I can tell you that we're looking at a long ago Pope, and you can tell from his headgear that he's not from the modern era. And in his thought bubble, you can see that he's known for power struggles with secular authority that I lost. And then his papal name in the Latin meant good fortune. So think about a time when the church wanted to be a major player on the world stage, or at least in Christendom, wanted to be influential. Think about the Latin word for good, try to get close to that, and then you might be able to come up with his papal name. So now we're going to turn and find out who this guy is. And if you guessed Pope Boniface VIII, then you are correct. So Boniface VIII was Pope from 1294 to 1303, so not very long. And when I said he was known for struggles with secular authority or area monarchs, an example of that comes from a papal bull that he issued called Unum Sanctum. And this is one of the things that he wrote in that bull. It is altogether necessary for salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. So he's definitely a strong-armed person, and that gives you a sense of his possibly authoritarian leadership style. And I say this because it was not appreciated by, well, very many people, but in particular was a problem for the King of France. He really didn't like that, the King of France at the time. So that's what I mean when I say that he tangled with secular authority. But I include this because it gives us an important point of contact with John Henry Newman. And here's why. I think that Boniface's conflicts prefigure the conflict between King Henry VIII of England and Pope Clement in the 1530s that resulted from Henry VIII breaking from Rome, declaring himself head of the Church of England, and de facto creating the Anglican Church. And guess who was a member of the Anglican Church? John Henry Newman. And then a positive note from Boniface is that he had something else in common with Newman. I think that we can all agree was a wonderful thing. And that's that Boniface, like Newman, valued university education and was supportive of it. But before Boniface actually named or proclaimed church doctors in 1298, church people had long recognized that there were certain early church fathers, saints who were especially impactful and important in their teachings. So Boniface, by taking this official step of naming those four the first doctors of the church in 1298, he basically just ratifies what was already happening from the bottom up, so to speak, that the church had long relied on the great theologians that were part of the tradition for deeper understandings of the current moment. And you can see who the first four lucky winners were. They're all familiar names. I know we're all especially familiar with St. Augustine. So now I'm wondering if you're wondering if you might be a doctor yourself someday, if you might qualify to be a doctor. So let's take some time out, and I'm going to let you take a little bit of a self-assessment. So I've got a series of questions here, and you can answer yes or no. Number one, are you or will you ever be a canonized saint? Have you produced theological insights, spiritual insights that clarify doctrine, crystallize doctrine in important areas? And have you left behind, or will you leave behind, a body of reliable teachings, durable teachings that will continue to guide the church past your lifetime and then well into the future? And then finally, has a pope or a church council officially declared you a doctor? Now, I realize that seems kind of obvious. You're a doctor because you're declared a doctor. But here's why that third point is important. And that's because the church quotes and references great theologians who aren't saints, who aren't doctors. So that happens all the time. And that happened with John Henry Newman. So his work had long been consulted by the church, referenced by the church, long before he was named a saint in 2019. In fact, every pope since Newman's lifetime has referenced him in some way, shape, or form. So clearly, I feel like Newman is well deserving of that doctor title. So let's look at some specifics that make him special and unique and worthy of that title, eminent teacher. So fun fact, and this is what we're looking for right here, I just took a picture of my catechism, our catechism from 1992 that everybody has lying around the house. Notice John Henry Newman is not a saint at that point. He's still Cardinal John Henry Newman, and he's referenced 4 different times in our catechism. So that was really wonderful to discover that. As well, most people agree that his writings were both studied by the theologians that attended the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s and were quite influential on them. And that would be both Newman's writings and Newman's habit of reading the patristic writings of the early church fathers. So he was really returning to the sources long before we had that term about returning to the sources that we kept hearing about after the Second Vatican Council. What was special too about Newman was he didn't set out to create a theological system. So he didn't think himself a theologian in the manner of like Thomas Aquinas or Augustine. He was someone who was responding to the concerns and the topics of his time, of his era. And he was so honest and devoted to being clear that he'd be controversial and he would be unpopular. So he was devoted to truth, even if that meant people weren't going to like him, about what he wrote. So topics that he wrote about how doctrine develops over time. He wrote about the role of the laity in the church, the sense of the faithful, and that we're an instrument of tradition as well as the hierarchy of the church. And he also wrote a lot about the importance of conscience and the need for our conscience to be formed and developed. And I don't have a citation on this, but I remember once that Pope Francis said that the church needs to be our conscience. Sorry, the church needs to form our conscience, not be our conscience. So that statement from Pope Francis is just very Newman-esque. And then, of course, Newman's other major work entitled The Idea of the University. That's where he talks about the nature and scope of Catholic higher ed. And that still guides Newman University, as well as Catholic colleges and universities everywhere. So let's think back. We talked about one of the criterion included the fact that the work needs to be that's left behind by a doctor needs to be relevant to people like in our time and into the future. So let's take a look at some recent examples of Newman in dialogue with us today. And we're going to stay on this slide, and I'm just going to read some quotes. One is from Pope Leo, who really about 4 weeks ago, it was on January 28th, in his general audience, Pope Leo was teaching about Dei Verbum, which you guys know, I'm sure, is the Constitution on Scripture and Tradition, Divine Revelation from the Second Vatican Council. And here's what the Vatican News article said. It provides context, and then it'll also provide Newman's words. To explain the living dimension of the Word of God and its relationship with tradition, the Pope quoted the doctor of the Church, St. John Henry Newman, who affirmed that, and now we begin with Newman's words, quote, Christianity, both as a communal experience and as a doctrine, is a dynamic reality in the manner indicated by Jesus himself in the parables of the seed, a living reality that develops thanks to an inner vital force. So Pope Leo was obviously quite taken with those words from Newman that he included those in his general audience. And then prior to that, back in November, Pope Leo mentioned Newman as someone whose, quote, theological study was always connected with prayer and spiritual experience, which are indispensable conditions for cultivating an understanding of revelation, which cannot be reduced to a commentary on formulas of faith. So what Pope Leo is hinting at is Newman's personalist spirituality, his one-to-one relationship with his creator, his prayer life, his spiritual practices. So we're going to hear a lot tonight about how Newman is cerebral and heady, but he was also a person of great heart. And so it's important because he is a saint. He is a holy model for all of us. And then next, I'd like to jump back to 2014. So the Vatican has various committees and commissions that are like working groups that advise the Vatican on different things. And there's one called the International Theological Commission. And you may have heard of this document that it compiled back in 2014 called Sensus Fidei, the sense of the faithful in the life of the church. And I think that title says a lot. Well, Newman was cited in that document 30-something times because he wrote so much about the role of the laity and the sense of the faithful. So he was quite clear and brilliant when he wrote on that topic. And then let's let Pope Francis weigh in as well. So Pope Francis had an encyclical in 2014 entitled On the Human and Divine Love of the Heart of Jesus Christ. And you're going to hear in here echo, obviously Newman, but also the wonderful spirit of Pope Francis, who we all miss so terribly. So in this encyclical, Francis explains the motto that Newman chose when he was named cardinal. So Newman, again, we know that he journeyed from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism. And after priesthood, later in his life, he was named by Pope Leo XIII as a cardinal of the church. And when you become a cardinal, you get to have a coat of arms, the little shield, and you get to choose a motto. And the motto that John Henry Newman chose, and I'll just give it to you in English versus Latin, was this: heart speaks to heart. And Francis said that Newman did this since, beyond all of our thoughts and ideas, the Lord saves us by speaking to our hearts from his sacred heart. This realization led Newman, the distinguished intellectual, to recognize that his deepest encounter with himself and with the Lord came not from study and reflection, but from his prayerful dialogue, heart to heart with Christ, alive and present. It was in the Eucharist that Newman encountered the living heart of Jesus. So in all of these, I want us to pause and just notice some key phrases that seem to have the same theme and come up among all of what both of those popes cited. So I'm just going to read some of those key phrases. Christianity, communal experience, and doctrine as a dynamic reality. Prayerful dialogue with Christ, alive and present. Living reality. And deepest encounter with himself and the Lord. So Newman didn't see the church or us pilgrims as like cold and static and stuck in one place, but the very opposite, like energetic and full of life. And church and pilgrim are in a dynamic, living relationship with us and with our Trinitarian God. And he saw the church as always on the move towards deeper understanding. So I mentioned conscience earlier. I want to bring that up again because he reflected on the voice of his creator, which he actually said he would hear that in his heart. He really felt like the voice of God was speaking to him. And reading some of his work, I get the sense that he almost couldn't understand himself outside of being God's created son. So while he would acknowledge things like the proofs for God, if you think of Thomas Aquinas and his various proofs for God, Newman said this about those types of religious arguments. He said, "These do not warm me or enlighten me. They do not take away the winter of my desolation or make the buds unfold and the leaves grow within me, or in my moral being rejoice." And that's just so lovely, the way he composes his sentences, that proofs for God don't warm him or enlighten him, take away the winter of his desolation, or make the buds unfold and the leaves grow within. So as much as he was a heady person, a scholar, he wrote theologically, he had some philosophical writings that he left behind, but he was also a deeply spiritual person. And that he brought that deep spirituality to his life as a pastor. So let's just hang on in our minds to that motto, heart speaks to heart, and enjoy kind of that window into his personal and prayer life as we learn more about him tonight. So we're going to move forward here and take a look at a piece of Newman's writing. And I'm going to read this. So this is from a meditation that he wrote, and it's a longer meditation, but I just pulled out this excerpt for us. And this is the first of many snippets of Newman's writing that we're going to take a look at tonight. And every time we do, I will read, and then we will take a break. And so I'm going to read first, and then I'll give you a set of instructions. God has created all things for good. all things for their greatest good, everything for its own good. What is the good of one is not the good of another. What makes one man or woman happy would make another unhappy. God has determined, unless I interfere with his plan, that I should reach that which will be my greatest happiness. He looks on me individually. He calls me by my name. He knows what I can do, what I can best be, what is my greatest happiness, and he means to give it to me. So I want you to, going to leave it on the screen, and I want you to take a few minutes. Some of you are on your own. Many of you are sitting with others, and just try to key in on a word or phrase that strikes you or is meaningful to you. So we're going to take a 5 or 6 minute break. And again, you can discuss it in your group, and I will call us back together in about 5 or 6 minutes. So I'm going to mute my mic as you guys take a look and reflect on this meditation from John Henry Newman. Okay, I'd like everybody to come back together from their discussion. And I notice we've got some things in the chat that people are sharing. David and Glenna from Pratt, reflecting on us being missionaries, being called by God for mission. And also, he means to give it to me. How fortunate we are that God has bestowed his blessing and love for us. And I'm going to share my reflection on this passage as well. But I'd like to invite, is there anybody who would like to open their mic and share what they were thinking about? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
I think we ended the thinking by saying fail better. But we talked about surrender and how that is like so necessary to, because God has a plan, and we will get the happiness that he has planned, or what, but yeah, surrendering is so difficult.
Agree. Very much so. Okay, thank you. And if you'll go ahead and mute again, thanks, Shruti. I'd like to share kind of my experience with this passage. I first became aware of John Henry Newman back in the early 2000s, and Colleen might have to correct me on some dates. But I'm thinking about the Called and Gifted workshops that were available through our diocese, and they were put on by the Catherine of Siena Institute out of Colorado Springs. And I attended, and probably many of you also attended. Mine was at the Mother House in Great Bend. And the presenters taught about our charisms, spiritual gifts that become available to us at baptism. And part of the presentation was sharing about saints and holy men and women and what their charisms were, so we could get some ideas of specific examples and what those charisms looked like in real life, so to speak. And John Henry Newman was presented to me in that context. And this passage was either part of that workshop, or I came across it later. And I love that idea of being chosen for some specific mission. So that led me on a journey, attending that Called and Gifted workshop, hearing the words of St. John Henry Newman, and being aware that I might have a specific work that I'm called to do. So all of that led me to the pastoral ministry formation program that Colleen coordinates, which is in partnership with Newman University. And I took some pastoral ministry formation classes on Saturday morning. Those classes led me into Newman's Masters of Theological Studies program. David Borho, who's on our Zoom tonight, he was in a cohort a cohort or two ahead of me in that program. And now here I am working for Newman University in Western Kansas, and I'm a theology adjunct for them. So John Henry Newman liked to reflect on divine providence, and I do really see divine providence in this connection that I've had with John Henry Newman through the Diocese of Dodge City, its partnership with Newman University, and all the connections that have unfolded in my life over the years. So super, super grateful for that. So we're going to transition now. I'm going to share screen again. So I'm going to go small, and we're going to take a look at a couple of slides. And I'd like to talk about Newman University and a little bit about its history. So first, I want to talk about the sisters, the Adorers of the Blood of Christ, founded by Saint Maria de Matthias in the 19th century in Italy. And interestingly, her life overlapped with John Henry Newman's. And she was felt called, her mission was to found communities of sisters who were not monastic, but were actually very active apostolic. So were teachers, made sure they were educating girls. And Maria's communities first spread throughout Italy, and then there were sisters that were affiliated with her in Germany and Austria. So it would be some German sisters who would end up coming to the US and starting the first version of Newman University, which was St. John's Academy. So they were experiencing some rough political conditions in Germany in the 1870s. They made their way first to Illinois and then to the US. So be thinking about all the immigration that happened to the US in the 1800s, and they would have been a part of that. So they made their way to Wichita. They wanted to serve. They wanted to meet local needs. They started a girls' academy, St. John's Institute, and you can see there the different iterations and evolutions from the same location on the current Newman campus. It became St. John's Institute. They were educating girls to be teachers. They added nursing. They eventually were educating young men. And over the years, it became a junior college and then a college, and then Kansas Newman College, which I hear that name all the time, but we really are Newman University as of 1998. So they were willing and able to evolve and adapt to the times. And the Adorer sisters are still so important to Newman U today. Their emphasis on social justice, the dignity of the person, and empowering the underserved, and encouraging our students to basically graduate and get out and transform society. What I have found in my preparations are some interesting overlaps between St. Maria de Matthias and St. John Henry Newman. And this is where, again, we're seeing God's providence at work. First of all, they were both educators. They both were called to form students academically, but more importantly, in their faith. They both lived in the challenging world of the 19th century, Newman in England, Maria in Italy. And this is significant. They both had important religious experiences in their late teens and early 20s. And Newman's was kind of a two-step experience, and I'm going to talk about the second step of that. And Maria's experience was being introduced to the precious blood spirituality. And at least in our area, you can talk to someone and they'll say, yeah, I was educated by the precious blood sisters. Those are the adorers of the blood of Christ. So she was introduced to precious blood spirituality, the idea that Christ spilled his blood for each and every one of us, for you and you and you and you. So it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman or a child. Demographic categories are irrelevant. He's for all of us, and we all have a work to do. So we know women didn't always have a role in the church, but this image captivated Maria, and it gave her a sense of purpose that she had a work to do, and she wanted to share this beautiful spirituality with others. Newman himself, while he's at Oxford University in his late teens, early 20s, he becomes captivated by the sacramental principle, this idea of finding God in all things. that created things are good, that created things are signs of God's presence and grace. And honestly, that's something I take for granted as a Catholic, that created things can be vehicles for God's grace. Think, obviously water, oil, bread, wine, the material parts of the church's sacraments. But that was a new and very intriguing idea to John Henry Newman. And I think it's a real key to his eventual conversion to the Catholic Church. So what did these religious experiences cause them to do? Into his later 20s, 30s, and 40s, it would lead John Henry Newman eventually into the Catholic Church. It would lead Maria to do the very hard work of establishing convents and schools throughout Italy. And she was a tough lady. Sometimes she was riding from Italian village to Italian village on a mule. So she really had a more physically challenging life than St. John Henry Newman. And if you notice their birth dates, he lived to be 89 and she didn't have such a long life. So she had a more physically demanding life. And then some other points of contact that are just kind of fun to look at. When the sisters who were affiliated with Maria's spirituality came to the US, it was in 1870, which is still during Newman's lifetime. So he becomes a cardinal in 1879. He dies in 1890. And then about 12 years later, the Adorers are in Wichita, and they're starting the first iteration of what will eventually become Newman University. And then I've got another fun fact to share. Notice that Newman dies 1890. It's only 3 years later, in 1893, that the first Newman Club, Newman Center, is established on a college campus. So you've probably heard of Newman Centers that serve Catholic students at lots of different public universities. They're really all over the US. The first one was at the University of Pennsylvania, and that started in 1893. So that just shows how vast his reach was, even shortly after his death, that people in the US were aware of his educational writings, aware of the idea of the university, and would see him as an inspiration to Catholic college students. And then how did Newman, kind of connect with the sisters and the early iterations of Newman University? I've got 2 dates on the bottom left there. One is in 1993, when Newman was still St. John's. There was a Father Hell who spoke about John Henry Newman to the students. And then later in 1945, by the time we're Sacred Heart, a Father Lamb gave a lecture about John Henry Newman. So I think it's safe to say that Newman was kind of in the air in Wichita. And meanwhile, across the US, college campuses were continuing to add Catholic centers in Newman's name. So currently at Newman U, we still daily tap into John Henry Newman's philosophy of educating the whole person, this idea of training the student's mind, yes, so they'll be credentialed for a job, but also so that they're functional and can meet their full potential as a human person. He saw students as individuals with a soul, not just as people taking classes, not just as people paying tuition. And then his wonderful approach of the relationship between faith and reason. Contrary to what was happening with the Enlightenment thinkers at the time, Newman advocated that faith and reason are compatible because all truth comes from God. So if we're pursuing knowledge in a biology class, that can reveal some aspect of God. If we're in a theology class, obviously we're going to be uncovering other aspects of God. So really all subjects, all academic disciplines point us to our God. So this approach and this mindset is what makes Newman U special, and I think Catholic higher ed in general pretty special. So let's move now to talk about the world that Newman was born into. And we just have a couple more slides before I go to camera. He lived almost the whole of the 19th century. So he was born 1801, he died 1890, that was in London. Again, the first half of his life, he was a Protestant. The second half of his life, he was a Catholic. So Britain was a superpower. The British Empire was everywhere at the time. Enlightenment rationalism and that type of thought was in full bloom. This is post-American Revolution, post-French Revolution. Religion was still in place, but there was also a skepticism towards religion that was in the air. Technology was advancing and the Industrial Revolution was happening. So you can see what those factories were like in Newman's day and how tough that would have been on those workers at the time. Queen Victoria was on the throne for most of Newman's life, so we can speak of the Victorian era. And two people whose lives overlapped with Newman's. One was Charles Darwin, so think about the theory of evolution and the impact that would have had. And then also Charles Dickens. He was making the novel popular. And that's important. It makes me remember to remind you guys or let you guys know the publishing world was really big in the 19th century in England. So I would argue it as prevalent as our social media is today. So when I think about those Dickens novels, they came out in installments. People would line up for the next chapter of Oliver Twist or whatever the novel was. Well, likewise, people were lining up for the next in a series of articles by John Henry Newman. So he was fortunate. He grew up in a middle-class family. And I mentioned that he had a two-step religious experience. The first, when he was young, closer to maybe 15 or 16, he had kind of a more, what we would describe as an evangelical Protestant type experience where he suddenly felt justified by faith through grace. But importantly, where he starts is not where he stays. So by the time he hits middle age, he will have journeyed through a more evangelical Protestant imagination in and through high church Anglicanism, and then finally into the Catholic Church. So we've got a picture of St. Paul's Cathedral there. Let's talk about the religious landscape of the time. To the best and brightest of the time in England and also Europe, religious faith was considered to be somewhat irrational, that it was an emotional experience, a felt experience, but it couldn't be approached through one's intellect. And Newman is going to be pushing back against that throughout his writings and his life. The country of England was obviously Anglican, and the Anglican Church was very much intertwined with government, with parliament, with monarchy. And the Anglican Church had some variety, almost a continuum within the Anglican Church. So some within Anglicanism were more Bible-based and preaching-based, and so the churches were plain. There's no candles, there's no vestments. And then there were also within Anglicanism more of the high church, where there was a few more of those flourishes that we would expect to see. And then there were some Protestant churches that had split off from Anglicanism. They were known at the time as dissenters. So think about the Wesleys, Charles Wesley, John Wesley of the Methodist Church, the Baptists, the Puritans, and the Quakers. They were all considered dissenters at the time. So what was the story with Catholicism? Well, Catholics were in the minority in England and had been for a while. I mean, you might even say it was the hated religion because there were anti-Catholic laws that were actually in place. Now, some of those were being rolled back during Newman's lifetime. In fact, he was alive when Parliament passed what was called the Catholic Emancipation Act. So if we needed emancipation, that means we didn't have all the freedoms that we should have had at the time. So one of the restrictions that was lifted would allow Catholics, if they wanted to hold public office. And Protestants viewed Catholicism with great suspicion, with the idea that the Roman Catholic Church had added things to the pristine, pure teachings of Jesus. So 2 examples of what they would have characterized as add-ons would be purgatory and our sacrament of confession. So those would have been viewed with suspicion. And Newman would have been someone who viewed by suspicion those 2 particular Catholic teachings. So I've got a short video clip that I'd like to show, and I hope the volume is good for everybody, but I'm going to explain it first and I'll explain it after. So if it's not perfect, don't worry, you miss out too much. You won't miss out too much. So I want to set it up. We're going to be looking at a video clip from a TV show of a very upper crust English Anglican family. They are hosting their Anglican vicar for dinner. And also at dinner is their Irish Catholic son-in-law, who is planning on baptizing his baby Catholic. And in this conversation, they're talking about how Catholics worship. So the vicar is concerned about the smells and bells of the Catholic Church. And isn't that just seemingly very pagan? So here we go.
Something of the English of the Roman Church. Since I am an Irishman, that's not likely to bother me. I cannot feel bells and incense and all the rest of that pagan followers pleasing God. I see. So is he not pleased by the population of France or Italy? Not as pleased as he is by the worship of the Anglicans.
Okay, so God is not as pleased with Catholics and how they worship as he is with the worship of the Anglicans. So this is from Downton Abbey, which is one of my favorite shows. And I want to point out this clip is set in the 1920s. So it's well after Newman's death, but those attitudes are still there. So if that's what it's like for Catholics in the 1920s, imagine what it would have been like for John Henry Newman, who joins the Catholic Church in the mid-1800s. It would have been really tough. Now, of course, early in Newman's life, he would have been suspicious by the bells and by the incense. He would have been suspicious of our devotion to Mary and the saints, even the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and of course, papal authority. So he would have been like that, but I want to keep in mind that he's always on a journey. So where he starts is not where he stays. So I want you to keep in mind these difficulties, because I want to look at another passage from something that he's written. So he wrote a book that's essentially his spiritual autobiography. The title is Apologia pro vita sua, which basically it's Latin for an explanation of my life, or we could say a defense of my life. And I'm going to be quoting from it throughout our evening tonight. So he wrote this book. Like I said, he was always engaged in the topics of the day. He wrote it in response to a man named Charles Kingsley, who had criticized Newman publicly and unfairly. You see, Newman's life after he became a Catholic had some ups and downs. And so he wasn't as popular as he was before he came into the Catholic Church. But writing his spiritual autobiography, which he did when he was in his 60s, kind of revived his career and his public image. So let's take a look at this short excerpt from the defense of his life. Newman writes, "Many persons are very sensitive of the difficulties of religion. I am as sensitive of them as anyone. But I have never been able to see a connection between apprehending those difficulties and doubting the doctrines to which they are attached. 10,000 difficulties do not make one doubt. 10,000 difficulties do not make one doubt." So he's fine with having to pray about, noodle through, study through, wrestle with difficulties that he has with church teachings. He's good with that struggle because it doesn't cause him to doubt. And the sentences at the bottom of the screen are where Newman gives us kind of an analogy. And I find this very helpful because it's about math. And when I was in school, I didn't like math. And the analogy says this: a man may be annoyed, or woman, that he or she cannot work out a math problem without doubting that it has an answer. So let's say I'm stuck. I'm stuck on this problem in algebra. I'm stuck on this problem in trigonometry. But just because I can't work out the answer doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I don't doubt that the teacher knows the answer, that there is an answer to be had. So 10,000 difficulties for Newman do not make one doubt. So I'd like to pause again and give you a chance to reflect on any difficulties you might have with church teachings. Do they make you doubt God? Do they make you doubt the church? And we're going to take another 5-minute break. And I'd like you to think about and discuss, if you're with other people's, the relationship for you between difficulties and doubt. And I'm going to mute my mic, and then we will come back together in about 5 minutes. Okay, everybody, I'd like to invite you to come back together. Would anyone like to share any reflections they had or thoughts they had about difficulties versus doubts? So a lack of understanding can lead to doubt, right? I guess a lack of understanding is a form of difficulty. Anybody else have any reflections on difficulties versus doubts?
Would this be like people that don't understand why you need to go to a priest for confession, and then the issues with birth control, euthanasia, and they don't need a church to tell them what to do. They can worship God anywhere.
Yeah, I think that pretty much spells it out, Karen. That those are a form of doubt, right? When you're saying, I don't believe that you're right. I doubt that you are right, church. I've got this better idea. But Newman was more accepting of the fact that because he had such a historical worldview, and he saw such the big picture of the long arc of the church. So to him, he thought, even if I don't understand this now, I can trust in the people that came before me, and it may get articulated in a way that I understand it better and have less difficulty with in 5 years, in 10 years, sometime in my lifetime. So he had a patience, I feel like, in that sense of the historicity of the church and the church teachings. So let's talk a little bit more about his life. And I kind of want to get into his 20s and his 30s and things that happened with him that were significant. So back to Newman, when we had our previous slide, I think you had seen that he was born in London. He also lived in Birmingham, England, which is my Zoom background. That's his study in Birmingham, but also Oxford. So Oxford, England, Oxford University is a super important chapter of Newman's life, and a long chapter. So he was there as a student. He was there as a tutor/professor. He was ordained as an Anglican minister. So he had a parish there on the Oxford campus. He was there for many years, and it was his true intellectual community. It was part of his identity. So what's tough for him is that eventually he's going to have to leave this elite institution because it's an Anglican institution, and his ideas are going to become, his beliefs are going to become over the years progressively more and more Catholic. So recall that to be English is to be Anglican. Those two things are tied together. And to be at Oxford meant to be Anglican. So what led him from that journey, from that evangelical Protestant stance that he started with when he was 15, into eventually seeing that he wanted to be a part of a church with practices, and teachings that dated back to the earlier apostles. He found that to be very, very necessary for himself. I think there's probably several factors at play. One is that Newman himself, he was obviously a scholar and a studious person. He was very much into reading the writings of the church fathers. So in the early centuries of the church, when many of the doctrines that we take for granted were being hammered out, especially many that we recite in the Nicene Creed, he's reading those and he's just relishing those and eating them up. And recall that he's ordained as an Anglican minister. And so he's Anglican minister in his identity, but as he's delving into these early church fathers, he discovers he's not finding some of his Protestant teachings in the early church fathers. For example, he couldn't find anything about justification by faith. He wasn't finding anything about predestination. And then as he's pastoring the people that are part of his parish, he's making home visits, he's getting to know them when they're sick and all of that kind of stuff. So he's in the struggles of their daily lives. And he realizes that he doesn't meet anybody that is so perfect that they're predestined for heaven or so evil that they're predestined for hell. So that's going to be one driver of his religious evolution. And then also, he did enjoy a felt relationship with God at that emotional level. We talked about his heart speaks to heart, personalist spirituality. But he also felt solidly that Christianity was more than just religious feeling, that these truths about God have their own reality, their own existence, and that we're able to articulate that reality in creeds and dogmatic teachings. Also, while he's at Oxford, he meets a lot of other like-minded individuals who shared his interest. Now, what we call the Catholic Church going all the way back to the apostles, they called that the primitive church. So they thought they were like a branch of the primitive church as Anglicans. And so Newman would be talking to them, eating lunch with them, sharing ideas with them. So his colleagues at Oxford who were like-minded were also influential on him. And then another factor was that in general, he was disturbed, and so were his colleagues, about the direction that the Anglican Church was going. So it was very much wrapped up in the state. And he actually said at one point that there was a need for a second Reformation. So think about the first Protestant Reformation. He's calling for a second Reformation, but he's not doing that quite yet. He's going to get there. Something big has to happen first, and that's going to be a trip that he takes when he's about 32 years old. He and a friend get on a ship. They're going to be gone for several months. They sail through and around the Mediterranean. And recall that he'd been reading the church fathers. So the ones who wrote about the dual nature of Christ and the Trinity and consubstantiality, Augustine on grace. They wrote about the sacraments, apostolic succession, all of that. So they're in his minds as he's on this trip. And then that combines with his experience of actually seeing Catholic churches in Italy and seeing Orthodox Christian churches in Greece. And he does like the church buildings, but at this point, he's still not sure what he thinks about individual Catholics and their piety. And he judges them as almost being superstitious and feeling like their devotion to Mary and the saints was excessive, it's over the top, and even kind of like a corruption to the true faith of the apostles in the primitive church. So he says later about this trip, we kept clear of Catholics throughout our tour. So that's kind of funny to think about where he ends up. But importantly, this trip is significant because the time away from Oxford gives him clarity. And he's going to resolve to work for reform in the Anglican Church and to call for it to embrace its most Catholic with a little c, universal elements. So looking like the church of the early centuries. So the liturgy, the sacraments, clear teachings, following the liturgical year. He's going to want the Anglican Church writ large to move this direction. And he feels like he's got this mission. So think about the meditation that he read. God has called me for something. There's a work that I am to do. And he actually does say to his travel companion, I have a work to do in England. And he feels very convicted about that. But he gets sick. He's very ill, and that holds him back for a while. So he's not on his time now. He's anxious and he's held back by this illness. When he does recover, he believes that God has spared him for this mission. So now he's going to double down. He's even more convicted. But unfortunately, he has another holdup, and that's when he's on the ship to sail back to England and return. The waters are super calm, and maybe there's not enough wind, and the ship is not able to sail. So he's, stuck on this ship, and he's going to pass the time and relieve his anxiety by writing a poem that later becomes a hymn. The official title is The Pillar of the Cloud, but most of us know it as Lead Kindly Light. And this is something that we'll pray at meetings that we have at Newman University. So I want you to imagine him, and I'm going to put it on the screen here in just a second. I want you to imagine him being in the dark on this ship. Perhaps it's a foggy evening, and there's just a bit of moonlight that's shining through. So here we have, lead kindly light amid the encircling gloom. Lead thou me on. The night is dark and I am far from home. Lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I love to choose and see my path, but now lead thou me on. So again, his writing is just so lovely. The night is dark and I am far from home. And then we have the contrast in this top line from light to the encircling gloom. And then the sense of trust that God is going to keep his feet steady, and that I do not have to see the distant scene. He just needs God to light one step for him. So one step is enough for me. And then in these lines, he noticed that he wasn't always that way. He remarks on that. I didn't always pray this way, God, for you to lead me on because I wanted to choose my path, but now lead thou me on. So I want to take a short break, not 5 minutes, but maybe 3 minutes for you guys to just talk about this in your small groups, and just to give you a second to process that. And then I will call us back together in about 3 minutes. Okay, let's reconvene. Colleen said you guys have reaction buttons. I'd like just to see a show of hands. Is this new to anybody? Is this the first time to hear an excerpt from Lead Kindly Light? Okay, new to Karen, new to Sister Rosemary, Janice. Okay, and it looks like others of you are familiar. Glenna, I know you are since you're on the Newman board. Lots of thumbs up out there. So yeah, it really is lovely. And if you get on YouTube, you can track down the hymn version of it. And there's multiple different versions of various choirs that are singing it as a hymn. So, okay, so let's go back into Newman's life. He arrives back in England, and by now it's 1833, so he's about 32 years old. And again, he is ready to reform the Anglican Church. And he joins up with others from Oxford who share this same goal. So they want to promote this sort of Anglo-Catholicism within the Anglican Church. So they're not talking about leaving the Anglican Church, but making it be the church that they feel like it should be. So Newman and friends from Oxford team up to write a series of essays, which they called tracts, Tracts, promoting Anglicanism, again, in its most Catholic expression. And this effort becomes known as the Oxford movement. So the Oxford movement is pretty famous. If you want to know more details about that, put that in a Google search and all kinds of things will come up. But what they're trying to do is navigate what they think of as a middle way, placing the Anglican Church in between what they consider to be two extremes. So one extreme is more Bible-based evangelical Protestantism, and the other extreme, as they call it, is, guess what? Roman Catholicism. Us, we're at the what extreme. And they call this middle ground that they hope to take and identify for the Anglican Church as its new pathway, they call it the via media in Latin. So what did they care about? What were they preaching and writing about? Well, one thing they cared about was the church as a visible institution. So the church under a bishop, but not necessarily a bishop appointed by parliament or monarchy. They wanted rites. They wanted the sacraments. They wanted dogmatic teachings. I think I mentioned candles, vestments, all of that. So remember when I said that to be English is to be Anglican? Well, they wanted to prove more of the universality of the church than was present in Anglicanism in their time. So that the authority of the church, they said, comes from God, not from Parliament. Okay, so they wanted that separation. But since King Henry VIII had separated from the Roman Catholic Church and had established himself as the head of the church in England, the result was the Anglican Church, so it always was intertwined. There wasn't a clear separation of church and state. So I see a hand up. Jana, do you have your hand up for now, or was that a question? Was that part of the response to Lead Kindly Light? Go ahead and open your mic if you have a question.
No, sorry, that was me responding to
the earlier one. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. No, it's still on my screen, so I'll just X that out. So during this Oxford movement, they write the series of essays and they number them. And Newman ends up, because you can tell he's a beautiful writer, right? He ends up writing most of the essays. So that has the effect of making him more well-known than he already was. So he was well-known for his wonderful sermons that he preached at the Anglican Church on the Oxford campus. This raises his public profile even higher. But remember, when you have a public profile and you're well-known, you're going to be open to criticism along the way. As he's continuing to write, has never left behind his study of the church fathers. So that's an ongoing activity for him. Think about it. He's got, the first 500 to 600 years of the church to read the writings from that era, from that very, very long era. So as he is continuing to read and study, and he's connecting with the early church, what's coming out in his writings is starting to sound to the Anglicans more and more like he's a Catholic, because the traditions of the early church that he's advocating for, if they look at a Roman Catholic Church, those are the same traditions. So that's going to make him very controversial as a public figure, but it happens over a period of time. I want to say maybe 8-9 years. So at one point, his opponents wanted to stop what they called the popery of the movement. Remember, everybody was very sensitive to papal, or allergic almost to papal authority and the idea of that. But to give his opponents credit, I would say they almost see where he's going before he does. He writes this about being criticized because he said he was criticized everywhere. And this is how he defines everywhere: in newspapers, in periodicals, at meetings, in pulpits, at dinner tables, in coffee rooms, and railway carriages. So as he gets into year 8 or 9 of this, he's starting to take more and more heat from the public. And he wasn't like an aggressive person because he was known to be reserved and more studious, but he did have a strong pen. So I think there's a lot of people that are reserved and shy, but when they write stuff, their true self can come out. And I think that was safe to say about Newman. So finally, he writes in another tract. They were numbered, so tract 90. And if you know anything about Newman, this is the famous tract 90 that we're going to get into now. That was read by Anglicans as too Catholic. So at this point, he's being accused of being a closet Catholic. So the critics are really after him. And there's going to be a lot of fallout from this that unfolds over about a 2-year period. But the end result is that Newman is going to have to stop writing. He's going to leave Oxford. He's going to leave his Anglican pastorship. And he's going to just move off to this small village nearby outside of Oxford. So later in the autobiography, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, he's going to write this. So this is a reflection when he's in his 60s, looking back at that time period in his 40s. He says, I discovered that the truth lay not with the via media, which again is that idea that the Anglican Church was the middle between evangelical Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. But the truth lay with what was called the extreme part. So that's not evangelical Protestantism when he means extreme. He means us, the Roman Catholics. And then he also described himself as being on his deathbed regarding his membership in the Anglican Church. So imagine the change that he underwent that was so shocking to the Anglican ecosystem, since he was well known as a pastor, a preacher, an Oxford tutor, and well known in the media because he was published all the time. So he goes to this basically exile in this small village outside of Oxford. It's called Littlemore. And gradually he's joined by other men who are like-minded to him. And they fill their days with prayer, with study, with worship, with writing. So from the outside, if you're Anglican, it's starting to look a lot like Newman has started a monastery in Littlemore, which is not the case because he's still Anglican at this point, but he's in this limbo in between being an Anglican and being a Catholic. Again, his poison pen, he could be very sarcastic. And I've got something that he said here that I just love because it shows also how grumpy he can be. But he's grousing that he was accused of cultivating a nest of papists. So that's like the worst thing that anybody could do is cultivate a nest of papists because everybody is against the Pope if they're Anglican. So Newman is going to take a few years of continued study and discernment. And again, gradually all the pieces are going to click into place. He's going to see that the Roman Catholic Church is the church that he's been reading and studying, that it's, following through the centuries, that it is one and the same. So what an important work that comes out of this time period is called The Development of Christian Doctrine. And I mentioned that in the context of the Second Vatican Council and the fathers there being influenced by some of Newman's work. This is a work that was influential on their thinking. But for Newman, that was a practical undertaking because that was him mentally and intellectually working out how these, what he called as accretions or add-ons, could be seen in Catholicism. So like, wow, how could we have a sacrament of confession? Where would that have come from? Or how could Catholics have certain understandings of Mary? Where did that come from? And as he began to work out in his mind how doctrine is an organic thing, kind of like an oak tree comes from an acorn. The acorn doesn't look anything like the oak tree, but yeah, that's one continuum, isn't it? From acorn to oak tree. He liked a lot of organic imagery when he was talking about how doctrine developed. Another image that was helpful to him was if you have a natural spring of water, it might be bubbling up and just look like a small puddle at its source. But as it flows down a mountain and it gathers momentum and gravity helps it, it becomes eventually a broad, wide, and deep river. So those are images that he used to help himself understand that, yeah, Catholicism is the early church, that they are one and the same, but new things have opened up. So they might look a little bit different, but in character, in essence, they are the same. So again, this book, this writing, the development of Christian doctrine is part of that discernment that helps him make his decision to request to be received and to be received into the Catholic Church. I don't know if this is legend or not, but it's said that his first confession to Father Dominic Barberi lasted hours. So I don't know if that one's true or if that's, we all kind of acquire legends if we're famous saints, right? But that's one thing that is said. So he's received into the church on October 9th, 1845. That is the day that we celebrate his feast day. So Newman University, we've always recognized that as his feast day, but it's just recently, within the last couple of the weeks, that the church has made that official into the universal calendar, so that now there's a set of readings that go with John Henry Newman, and his name will be mentioned in Mass on October 9th. So you can celebrate that in full this coming October 9th, the feast day of John Henry Newman. And do you notice anything different about his feast day versus the feast days of other saints? I'll give you a second to think about, and if you know the answer, go ahead and open your mic. How is his feast day of October 9th different from the feast days of most saints?
It's not his death.
Very good, CT. It's not his death day. So he's the only one whose feast day is the date of his being received into the Catholic Church. So isn't that's something that you can kind of share with others who don't know very much about him. So now he's 44 years old, and he's essentially beginning what he can think of as the second half of his life. A few years later, he will be ordained as a Catholic priest. And I should mention that Newman was unmarried. When he was a teen, remember, he had kind of an evangelical Protestant experience. At that point, he wondered if he ever would want to be a missionary. So he wanted to leave that opportunity open to himself. So even as a young man, he chose to never get married or have a family so that he would be available to do that if he wanted to. So celibacy was no obstacle to him being ordained a Catholic priest. So let's kind of step back and think about, why was all of this search for the, as he would say, one true church, why was that so essential for Newman? Because today we church shop all the time. I will hear about a family moving from this church to that church because they're not being fed, or something happened with the pastor. We're very casual these days about moving from church to church if we're Protestant. And then sometimes even Catholics are very casual about sneaking into another parish that's not in their geographical area because they want something different. So I'm going to let Newman answer that in his own words. Listen to what he wrote to a friend. He wrote so many letters to friends and acquaintances and associates. So he wrote this a full year before he was received into the church. He said, "As far as I know myself, my one paramount reason for contemplating a change is my deep, unvarying conviction that our church is in schism, and that my salvation depends on my joining the Church of Rome." So this was clearly important to him. It was on that level of eternal life for him. And he is someone, and this is, I think, part of his character that makes him unique, or is a gift to us, is that when he's got a deep certainty, he's going to act on it, even if it makes him unpopular, even if he loses friends, even if he's rejected by everybody he knows and becomes a big nobody. He does that. And so that's really beautiful, I think, and a gift to us. And then he's received into the church. And years later, he said this, that ever since he joined the church, "I have been in perfect peace and contentment. It was like coming into port after a rough sea." So that's a generous statement on his part, because that second half of his life wasn't exactly smooth, because he's sort of a misfit. He's a Catholic in a predominantly Anglican nation. He'd left that church behind, and Catholics aren't so sure about him either. So he doesn't always fit in, and it does take him a while for him to find his way. And I want to highlight his experience at seminary in Rome to show why and how he didn't quite fit in. Seminarians at the time, and think about this, he would have been, 20 years older than most of the seminarians that he was in training with. They weren't trained through academic inquiry, but and by exploring the writings of actual theologians. So they weren't reading primary text, but Newman had been reading the patristic writings. He'd been reading all the primary texts. But at the time in the 19th century, seminarians were reading manuals and commentaries. So they were likely memorizing like formulaic definitions and theological concepts that had been kind of boiled down for them. And the main thrust in the church then, because we're still in that Council of Trent mode, right, of defense, we as Catholics, it didn't leave a lot of room for individual conscience, because the church's emphasis in that time was that truth is constant and unchanging. And here it is, it's this relic that I'm going to hold in my hand, and now I'm going to pass it on to Janice as is. But Newman, as we said, was someone for whom conscience and listening to the voice of God through that prayer relationship or through his own lived experience was super, super important. And so he was kind of a fish out of water at the time. But we know it's going to come right in the end, because he's going to inspire the Second Vatican Council and have his impact. But speaking of those writings on conscience that still guide us today, one of those citations in the Catechism is from something that he wrote on conscience. And so trusting that he could listen to the voice of God to discern truth and to understand separately that doctrine can develop. So the acorn becoming an oak tree. So now we're going to kind of move through the decades a little bit quicker. After seminary and ordination, he's going to start a community of priests in Birmingham. It's going to be an oratory. So that's in the spirit of St. Philip Neri. And he's going to pastor the working class. So this is an industrial city. So think about the picture we saw with all the smokestacks of the factories of London. And I read that he actually ministered to people through several cholera epidemics. So life was hard for working people at that time. So as much as he was still studying and writing and reading, he was also available to people in kind of that boots on the ground fashion in the day to day. Now we'll just kind of overview the final decades of his life. When he's in his 50s, he's asked to head up a new Catholic university in Dublin. And he doesn't last in that position. He doesn't really do that well for a lot of different reasons. That's a whole history in and of itself. But what comes out of that that's great is the idea of the university. So he gave a series of lectures and talks about his philosophy of the nature and scope of Catholic higher education, because they wanted theological education, university education to be available to Catholics who weren't just going to seminary, but just ordinary Catholics. So we will go back to the idea of the university in just a bit. Next decade, when he's in his 60s, that's when he writes his spiritual biography, which I've been quoting from, the explanation of his life. And that came out in installments. So kind of like Dickens novels would come out in installments. And that really revives his public image, because people are waiting eagerly, people who knew him, people who didn't know him personally, my religious opinions since this time period are the titles of all the chapters. So they wanted to know his evolution and how he changed over time. So his public image is revived, his career is revived. And after that, I would say his life goes much smoother. Then when he's in his 70s, he's named a cardinal. This is by Pope Leo XIII. So we've got this wonderful book ending of Pope Leo XIII, honoring John Henry Newman as a cardinal of the church, and now Pope Leo XIV designating Newman as a doctor of the church. So I think that's really lovely as well. And then when he dies at age 89, it's said that people line the streets as his funeral procession goes by. So you can see that his impact on his contemporaries, as a public figure, even as a controversialist that took a lot of opposition and criticism, but also as an educator and a writer, and most importantly, a pastor to the people of Birmingham, that impact was clear. And then part of the more information document that's on the Adult Formation webpage, I've got a link in there where you can access his obituary in one of the London newspapers. And if you haven't read a 19th century obituary, you're in for a treat, because, you know, it's probably 1,000 words long and very flowery. And so you can get a sense of that he was beloved, he was respected by the people of his time. So check that out on the Adult Formation page. So what we're going to do next is take a look at some snippets of Newman's writing, both fiction and nonfiction, because he was a fiction writer. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But first, I want to take a pause just so you can absorb everything that we've been talking about, maybe take a biology break. And if you'd like to, just with yourself or with the people at your site, think about the challenges that Newman chose to put himself through. And what can we today take from that example? So it is 7:45, and we'll come back together at 7:50. Okay, I just noticed the time, so I hope you don't mind if we come back a minute early. And my son just hopped on, so welcome, Thomas. Thanks for joining. I sure appreciate that. We're going to conclude by taking a look at a few snippets of Newman's writing. And we won't have time for reflection just because we're almost at the end of our session. But I want to show you, this is from Newman's book, Loss and Gain. So he was a nonfiction writer, obviously, a controversialist, but he also wrote poems. He also wrote literature. This novel, Loss and Gain, is about a student at Oxford University who converts from the Anglican faith to Catholicism. So clearly it's loosely biographical. And the main character is Charles, and Charles has dropped into a Catholic church where Mass is going on, and Charles doesn't know a whole lot about it. But I'm going to read it, and we're going to get a sense of what his impressions were. So he observes that a priest, or at least an assistant, had mounted for a moment above the altar and removed a chalice or vessel which stood there. He could not see distinctly. A cloud of incense was rising on high, and the people suddenly all bowed low. What could it mean? The truth flashed on Charles, fearfully yet sweetly. It was the Blessed Sacrament. It was the Lord incarnate who was on the altar, who had come to visit and to bless his people. It was the great presence which makes a Catholic Church different from every other place in the world, which makes it, as no other place can be, holy. So Pope Francis had referenced that the presence of Christ in the Eucharist was so close to John Henry Newman's heart. And I think we can see that in this description from the novel Lost and Gained. And by the way, people find Newman's writing, it can be kind of hard to plow through, but they do find his fiction really accessible if you can come across any of Newman's fiction. Okay. I wouldn't be a good Newman University representative if I didn't mention the idea of the university. So this is just a brief quote from that. And Newman writes that when the intellect has at once been properly trained and formed to have a connected view or grasp of things, it will display its powers with more or less effect. In the case of most men and women, it makes itself felt in the good sense, sobriety, reasonableness, candor, self-command, and steadiness of view. So this tells me that as we train and educate students at Newman University and Catholic universities writ large, that they get this integrated view of the world, and that they grow themselves so that, they have their careers, but they're going to have all these other good qualities as well. And we want that because part of our outcomes that we want for students is for them to be able to transform at least their corner of the world, and to kind of make their whatever profession they land in to be healed if it's broken in any way. And then one more, and then we'll close, from the development of Christian doctrine. So again, talking about how doctrine unfolds over time. From the nature of the human mind, he writes, time is necessary for the full comprehension and perfection of great ideas, and that the highest and most wonderful truths, though communicated to the world once for all by inspired teachers, could not be comprehended all at once by the recipients, but have required only the longer time and deeper thought for their full elucidation. So I can think about the Trinity. So what would the first apostles, pick St. Peter, a fisherman, what would he have understood about God being three in one? It's going to be maybe an acorn understanding. And then as centuries unfold and more people have contributed to teaching and explaining it and pulling out different aspects of that reality, then it's understood in a bigger way in the 3rd century, and so on and so on and so on. So that idea Newman has that time is necessary for more comprehension and more perfection of these wonderful ideas. Okay, and since we're so close to our time, I want us to read this out loud together. This will work as our closing prayer as well. And this is another section of Newman's meditation. So I'd like you to join just at your sites. Join me in reading this out loud. God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. Therefore, I will trust him. Whatever, wherever I am, I can never be thrown away. If I am in sickness, my sickness may serve him. In perplexity, my perplexity may serve him. If I am in sorrow, my sorrow may serve him. He may take away my friends. He may throw me among strangers. He may make me feel desolate, make my spirit sink, hide the future from me. Still, he knows what he is about. St. John Henry Newman, and St. Maria de Matthias, pray for us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now I'd like for anybody who's had enough, feel free to exit the Zoom and say goodnight. And I'm willing to stay on for a few more minutes if anybody wants to talk a little bit more, or you have a question or a comment that you'd like to throw my way. I'll stay here on the Zoom. But thank you everybody for coming. Thanks for your time tonight, your attention, and thank you, Colleen, for bringing us together. And I'll stay on the
Thank
Zoom.
you.
Trish, great job. Woo!
Thank you, everybody, for all I see hearts and clapping hands and waving people.
Yeah,
So,
can we see Thomas's face?
yeah, Thomas Keller, Sister Catherine Trish wants you to turn on your camera.
Great to
Because
see you,
he's now
Sister
a
Catherine.
grown adult. Good to see you, Thomas. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Great to see you as well.
Thanks, Trish.
Those
That's
two go way
very
back.
nice. Excellent.
Finally.
Thank you, Trish. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenna. Thank you for
You bet.
coming. Thank
You
you to
bet.
David, too.
He's here. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Trish.
Thanks, Janice. See you around.
Bye.
Thank you, St. Dominic's. Thanks, Shruti.
Okay.
Okay.
Good, cousin.
Thanks, Janine, for that nice comment.
I will find out. Yeah. What?
Okay. I'd love to hear if anyone who's staying on has any specific questions or comments.
Trish, I think that the prayer there, it reminds me so much of what Jesus also had so much more to tell you, but you didn't bear it now.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
know.
That's a great way to, yeah, you can't handle it all now. Like, you can't handle the truth. It's going to unfold over time.
It gradually has to come about,
And-
slowly, and even though you want it all now,
Yeah.
get it all now.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the life of us as individuals, but in the life of the church as well.
Yeah.
But Patricia,
Yes, sister.
I would like to commend you for your very eloquent teaching. I see you have a great passion for what you are doing.
Thank
and
you.
I so commend you for sharing this with us, for your desire to know Newman, to know who you are, because it's coming through. But I also trust that this passion you have for what you are teaching and preaching and living, that you will continue. And I'm so admired you tonight for everything that you so eloquently spoke about.
Well, those are very kind words and inspiring.
Thank you.
So if I'm ever tired, I'll think about what you're saying and I'll stick to it.
Amen.
Stay the course.
Peace.
Yeah, peace to
Many
you.
things
Thanks so
your
much.
I think that's a good confirmation that teaching is your charism. Trish.
Yeah, so I've been discerning this charism of teaching for whatever, 20 something years. I wish I could remember when the Call to Gifted workshop was.
It was in 2000. You were right. It was in 2000. Yeah.
Okay.
So we've had about 25 of them since in English
Okay.
and Spanish. So very good. Yeah. Thank you so much, Trish. Does anybody else have any more comments or?
Yeah.
Yes.
Anybody else who's staying on, feel free to open your mic.
I have a comment to make to Colleen, because I know that she has a real passion for adults, and that she's had many struggles throughout her ideas and wanting to be part of the church and wanting to bring forth some new ideas and new thoughts and feelings. And you did superb getting Tricia tonight, Colleen. Amen.
Yeah, it was great. We
Yeah.
just, it was a great meeting, wasn't it, Trish, when we came
Yeah,
up with
this
the
was
idea?
really enjoyable.
Yes, it was great. Well, we will have Trish do some more things for us, hopefully.
Sure. If we
Yeah.
ever want to do a follow-up and go in depth on, go more narrow with Newman, that could be something too.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Well, I
Okay.
guess we are at time, unless there's a final question.
Thank you for everything.
All right,
Thank you.
Karen, thanks for
Thank you,
coming.
all
I
you
appreciate
groups.
it.
Thank you, Kinsley. Thank you, Scott City, for coming. We appreciate your your group's gathering. Thank to the others too for being there. Good night. Good night.
All right.
Trish.
Good night, everybody. Take care.